August 6, 1942. Deep inside the Shokaku aircraft carrier, anchored in Truk Lagoon, 5 Japanese admirals sat in a smoke-filled conference room. They had been silent for 10 minutes. Maps covered the table. Casualty reports were scattered everywhere. Intelligence summaries painted a grim picture. Then, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi spoke the words that shattered the room's tension. "Gentlemen, the war is lost." No one argued, no one protested, because every man in that room knew the terrible truth. Japan had already been defeated, not by American guns, not by carrier battles, but by the very attack that was supposed to win them the war. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The attack that changed everything, but not in the way Japan had planned. This is the story of how Japan's greatest tactical victory became its most devastating strategic failure. Let me take you back 8 months. December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m., Hawaii time. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had orchestrated what military historians would call a masterpiece of tactical planning. The first wave of Japanese aircraft swept across Pearl Harbor like a storm. Dive bombers screamed down from the sky. Torpedo bombers skimmed across the water at impossible angles. Fighter planes strafed everything that moved. The devastation was overwhelming. 8 American battleships, the pride of the Pacific Fleet, were sunk or heavily damaged. The Arizona exploded in a fireball that killed over 1,000 men in seconds. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. The California, the West Virginia, the Tennessee, all crippled or destroyed. 188 American aircraft were obliterated on the ground, never even getting airborne. 2,403 Americans died that morning. Another 1,000 were wounded. From a tactical perspective, the attack was executed almost perfectly. Japanese pilots had trained for months, practicing on mock-ups that replicated Pearl Harbor's layout. They achieved complete surprise. American radar operators spotted the incoming planes, but their warnings were dismissed. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, and Japanese losses were minimal. Just 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. Almost perfect. But almost is the most dangerous word in warfare, because 3 critical mistakes became apparent immediately to those paying attention. First, the American aircraft carriers weren't in port. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was delivering planes to Midway. Saratoga was on the west coast. All 3 survived, untouched. Second, the massive fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, containing 4.5 million gallons of oil, weren't targeted. These tanks, sitting above ground and completely vulnerable, were left intact. Third, the submarine base was ignored. The repair facilities and dry docks remained operational. The machine shops, the supply depots, the infrastructure that made Pearl Harbor function, all still standing. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, had the opportunity to launch a 3rd wave of attacks. Some of his officers begged him to do it, but Nagumo refused. He was concerned about American counterattacks. He wanted to preserve his forces for future operations. That decision would haunt Japan for the rest of the war. But even more damaging than what wasn't destroyed was something else entirely. Something Japanese planners hadn't anticipated. The psychology of the attack itself. There's a famous quote attributed to Admiral Yamamoto after Pearl Harbor. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Historians debate whether he actually said those exact words. But Japanese naval intelligence documents from early 1942 prove that Yamamoto and other senior admirals understood a fundamental truth. Japan had a narrow window of opportunity. Their own intelligence estimates gave them 6 to 8 months before American industrial production would begin to overwhelm every Japanese advantage in training, experience, and strategic positioning. 6 to 8 months. That was the clock ticking down from December 7th, 1941. But Pearl Harbor did something Japanese planners completely failed to anticipate. It unified American public opinion in a way nothing else could have. Before Pearl Harbor, America was deeply divided. Isolationism was the dominant political force. Yes, President Roosevelt wanted to support Britain against Nazi Germany. Yes, he wanted to confront Japanese aggression in Asia, but the American people? They wanted no part of another foreign war. Congress was split. Public opinion polls showed that over 80% of Americans opposed entering the war in Europe. The memory of World War I, the trenches, the gas attacks, the millions of dead for seemingly nothing, was still fresh. Japan could have attacked only British and Dutch colonial possessions in Southeast Asia. Would America have entered the war immediately? The answer is unclear. Roosevelt wanted to, but would Congress have declared war without a direct attack on American territory? We'll never know, because Pearl Harbor gave Roosevelt exactly what he needed. The attack looked like treachery. Japanese diplomats were supposed to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack began. But due to decoding delays at the Japanese embassy in Washington, the declaration wasn't delivered until after the attack had started. This timing, whether intentional or accidental, made Pearl Harbor appear as a sneak attack, a violation of international norms, a stab in the back, while diplomats were still talking peace. President Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. That phrase became seared into American consciousness. Within days, recruitment stations were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young men lined up around city blocks, waiting hours for the chance to enlist. Women volunteered for war work. Factories that had been resistant to government contracts suddenly ramped up production. War bonds, sold to finance military operations, were oversubscribed by massive margins. Americans bought bonds worth hundreds of millions of dollars, far exceeding every target. The attack had handed America a perfect rallying cry. And once that giant was awakened, once American industrial might was fully mobilized, nothing could stop it. But Japan's admirals didn't fully grasp this reality until 6 months later. June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway. This was supposed to be Japan's decisive victory. Admiral Yamamoto planned an operation so complex, so overwhelming, that American forces would have no choice but to engage and be destroyed. The plan involved multiple carrier groups approaching from different directions, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, a main assault on Midway Atoll that would force the American carriers into a trap where they'd be outnumbered and outgunned. On paper, it was brilliant. In execution, it became Japan's worst nightmare. Because American codebreakers had done the impossible. They had broken Japanese naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been intercepting and decrypting Japanese communications for months. They knew Midway was the target. They knew when the attack would come. They knew the composition of Japanese forces. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, perfectly placed to ambush the Japanese strike force. The battle lasted 3 days, and in those 3 days, Japan lost the war. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sunk. These weren't just ships. They were irreplaceable combat platforms crewed by irreplaceable pilots. Let me put this in perspective. Japan entered the war with 10 fleet carriers. By June 1942, they had lost 4 at Midway. 2 others were damaged. That left Japan with just 6 operational fleet carriers by August 1942. Meanwhile, American shipyards were building carriers at a pace that stunned Japanese naval planners. Not just building them better. The Essex-class carriers were larger, faster, and more capable than anything Japan could construct. Intelligence reports in that August 6th conference room revealed the terrifying truth. American shipyards had over a dozen fleet carriers under construction. The first ones would enter service in early 1943. By 1944, the United States would have such overwhelming numerical superiority that Japanese defensive strategy would become mathematically impossible. But the carriers were just the beginning of the nightmare. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, was present at that August meeting. He had been wounded at Midway and was still recovering, but his tactical expertise was needed. Fuchida presented an analysis that devastated everyone in the room. Japanese naval aviation had begun the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. These men had trained for years, some for nearly a decade. They were arguably the best carrier pilots in the world in December 1941. By August 1942, just 8 months into the war, roughly 40% of them were dead. Killed at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, killed at Midway in June, killed in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign that had just begun. The survivors were exhausted, flying multiple missions per day with inadequate rest, inadequate food, inadequate everything. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training programs were producing maybe 100 new carrier-qualified pilots per month, and these new pilots had perhaps 200 hours of flight time. Compare that to the 800-plus hours the veterans had accumulated before the war even started. 200 hours versus 800 hours. That's not a gap, it's a chasm. American pilot production told a completely different story. The United States was training thousands of pilots monthly. Their initial training wasn't as intensive, true, but the sheer numbers meant that American losses could be replaced rapidly. Japanese losses couldn't be replaced at all. Every experienced Japanese pilot lost was effectively irreplaceable. You can build a new carrier in 2 years. You cannot build a new veteran pilot in 2 years. Fuchida's calculation was brutal in its simplicity. At current attrition rates, Japan would run out of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, regardless of how many carriers they had. A carrier without trained pilots is just an expensive floating target. The admirals in that conference room reviewed intelligence reports that revealed the true scope of the industrial catastrophe facing Japan. Let's talk about aircraft production. In 1941, American factories produced approximately 19,000 military aircraft. Japanese factories produced about 5,000. That's a 4-to-1 advantage for America, which was already concerning. But the gap wasn't staying stable. It was widening exponentially. American production was accelerating at a rate that seemed impossible. By 1943, intelligence estimates suggested the United States would produce 85,000 aircraft annually. 85,000. Japan? If everything went perfectly, if there were no material shortages, no bombing raids, no labor problems, Japan might produce 16,000 aircraft in 1943. 16,000 versus 85,000. That's not a production gap. That's a production apocalypse. And it wasn't just the numbers. It was the quality, the logistics, the spare parts, the fuel, the ammunition, the trained mechanics to maintain them. American factories were producing complete logistics chains. Every aircraft came with trained crews, spare engines, replacement parts, maintenance manuals, specialized tools. The entire industrial ecosystem was being replicated at massive scale. Japanese factories were struggling to produce the aircraft themselves, let alone the supporting infrastructure. Then there were the ships. Japan's economy depended entirely on imports. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from China and Southeast Asia. All of it had to be shipped across thousands of miles of ocean. Admiral Yamaguchi presented shipping loss statistics that painted a terrifying picture. January 1942, Japan lost 15 merchant ships to American submarines and aircraft. June 1942, 30 ships per month. August 1942, 40 ships monthly. The trend line was unmistakable. If losses continued accelerating at this rate, By 1944, Japan wouldn't have enough merchant shipping to maintain basic economic function, much less support military operations across the Pacific. And Japan's shipbuilding capacity couldn't keep pace. They could build perhaps 200,000 tons of merchant shipping per year. They were losing 300,000 tons per year, and the losses were accelerating every month. You don't need to be a mathematician to see where that equation leads. But even these numbers didn't capture the full scope of the disaster, because the fundamental problem wasn't just American strength growing, it was Japanese strength declining. Japan had conquered vast territories in the first 6 months of the war. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, numerous Pacific islands. This expansion created a defensive perimeter thousands of miles long. Defending it required dispersing Japanese forces across dozens of garrisons, many in isolated locations that were difficult to supply and impossible to reinforce quickly. The Americans, by contrast, could concentrate their forces. They could choose where and when to attack. They could mass overwhelming strength at a single point, while Japan had to defend everywhere simultaneously. This fundamental asymmetry meant that even with equal forces, the Americans had the advantage. But forces weren't equal. American strength was growing every month. Japanese strength was declining every month. The mathematics were inescapable. In early August 1942, American forces had just landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Japanese forces were fighting desperately to dislodge them. But the admirals in that conference room recognized what Guadalcanal really represented. It was a preview of American strategy for the rest of the war. Seize a forward base, build an airfield, use that airfield to dominate the surrounding area, then advance to the next target and repeat the process. It was methodical, grinding, inexorable, and it worked. Japan couldn't match this approach because Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate. Japanese industrial production couldn't provide enough aircraft, ships, and supplies to match American reinforcement rates. Every battle was becoming a battle of attrition, and Japan was losing the attrition calculus at every level. Pilots, ships, aircraft, supplies, fuel, everything. One admiral raised the possibility that perhaps, if Japan could inflict enough casualties on American forces, make the cost of advancing so high, American public opinion might turn against the war. This hope was systematically demolished by the intelligence assessments. American casualty tolerance appeared much higher than Japanese planners had anticipated. Reports of the Bataan Death March and Japanese treatment of prisoners had enraged American public opinion, making the war intensely personal. Americans weren't calculating costs and benefits like a business transaction. They wanted revenge. They wanted total victory. Casualty lists that might have discouraged other nations seemed only to strengthen American resolve. Moreover, American tactics were evolving to minimize casualties. American forces weren't engaging in suicidal banzai charges. They were using overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and material advantages to grind down Japanese positions while minimizing their own losses. The Americans were fighting an industrial war. They were treating it like a production problem to be solved through superior resources and logistics. And America was very, very good at production problems. Captain Fuchida presented perhaps the most depressing analysis of all: the oil situation. Japan's entire strategic calculus for going to war had been built around one critical resource: oil. American oil embargoes in 1941 had threatened to strangle Japan's economy and military. Japan's domestic oil production was essentially zero. Without imported oil, the Japanese military would grind to a halt within months. Seizing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, was meant to solve this existential problem. And Japan had succeeded brilliantly in that objective. The oil fields were captured mostly intact in early 1942. Success. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Because capturing oil fields and actually using that oil are two completely different problems. The oil had to be transported from Indonesia to Japan. That meant tankers making a journey of thousands of miles through waters increasingly infested with American submarines. In January 1942, Japan successfully imported 400,000 tons of oil from the Dutch East Indies. By August 1942, imports had dropped to 250,000 tons. The trend was crystal clear. By 1943, submarine warfare would likely cut oil imports to levels insufficient to maintain military operations. Japan would have oil fields, but no way to get the oil home. It's like owning a gold mine at the bottom of the ocean. Technically valuable, but functionally useless. American submarines were becoming more effective every month. Early in the war, American torpedoes had serious defects. Many failed to explode. Many ran too deep. But by mid-1942, these problems were being fixed. And American submarine commanders were becoming more aggressive, more experienced, more deadly. Every tanker sunk was a double blow to Japan. Not just the lost oil, but the lost ship. And Japan couldn't build tankers fast enough to replace losses. The admirals reviewed projections that showed Japan's oil situation becoming critical by late 1943, catastrophic by 1944. Without oil, the combined fleet couldn't operate. Aircraft couldn't fly. Trucks couldn't transport supplies. The entire military machine would seize up like an engine without lubricant. There was another devastating realization in that conference room. Japanese naval codes were compromised. The admirals didn't know the full extent. They didn't know about Station Hypo, didn't know about Commander Rochefort, didn't know that virtually every major naval communication was being read by the Americans. But they knew enough to be deeply worried. The Midway operation had gone wrong in ways that suggested the Americans knew it was coming. Ship movements that should have been surprises weren't. American carriers appeared in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time, or from the Japanese perspective, exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Fighting a war when your opponent can read your orders is nearly impossible. It's like playing poker when your opponent can see your cards. No amount of skill or courage can overcome that fundamental disadvantage. Japanese communications security was outdated, based on assumptions about American cryptographic capabilities that were years out of date. And changing codes now, implementing new systems across the entire Navy while fighting an intensive war, was a massive undertaking that might not even solve the problem. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence about American capabilities was proving woefully inadequate. Before the war, Japanese intelligence had underestimated American industrial capacity by enormous margins. They had misunderstood American public psychology. They had failed to predict how rapidly America would mobilize. These weren't small errors. These were fundamental failures that undermined every strategic assumption Japan had made about fighting the United States. The final document reviewed in that conference room was perhaps the most damning of all, an economic analysis prepared by the Finance Ministry. It projected Japanese economic capacity through 1945 under various scenarios: optimistic, realistic, and pessimistic. Even the most optimistic scenarios showed economic collapse by late 1944. Japan's economy simply couldn't sustain a total war effort for more than 3 years, and they were already 8 months into the war. The problem was fundamental. Japan's economy was a fraction of America's size. Japanese GDP in 1941 was perhaps 1/10 of American GDP. Japanese steel production was less than 10% of American production. Japanese oil production was essentially zero compared to America's vast domestic reserves. In a prolonged war of attrition, these disparities guaranteed defeat. There was no strategy, no tactic, no amount of courage or skill that could overcome the raw mathematics of industrial capacity. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. He had opposed war with the United States, arguing passionately that Japan couldn't win a protracted conflict. He had been overruled by army leaders and civilian government officials who believed American democracy was weak and decadent. They believed Americans lacked the will to fight a long war. They believed a quick series of victories would force American capitulation. Every single one of these assumptions was proving catastrophically wrong. American democracy wasn't weak. It was resilient and adaptive. Americans didn't lack will. They were more determined than ever. Quick victories hadn't led to capitulation. They had led to absolute commitment to total victory. The admirals in that room faced an impossible situation. They could see the future with terrible clarity. They knew the war was lost, they knew Japan was headed for complete defeat, but they also knew that recommending peace negotiations would be treated as defeatism, possibly treason. The military government wasn't interested in reality. They were committed to fighting to the bitter end, no matter the cost. Admiral Yamaguchi proposed recommending to higher command that Japan seek peace negotiations immediately before the situation deteriorated further. The proposal was rejected, not because the other admirals disagreed with the analysis, they all knew Yamaguchi was right, but because they knew such recommendations would be ignored or worse, treated as treason. The meeting concluded with no decisions, no recommendations, just a shared understanding of the terrible truth. Japan had lost the war on December 7, 1941. It just didn't know it yet. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic catastrophe of the first magnitude. It had achieved nothing Japan needed while unifying and enraging the one opponent Japan absolutely needed to avoid fighting. The admirals filed out of that conference room on the Shokaku, returning to their duties. They would plan operations they knew couldn't succeed. They would fight battles they knew couldn't be won. They would watch as Japan's cities were bombed, its navy destroyed, its empire lost, its people starved. 3 more years of war lay ahead. 3 years of suffering that would end only with atomic bombs and unconditional surrender. But in that conference room on August 6, 1942, 5 admirals already knew how the story would end. Pearl Harbor had been Japan's greatest victory, and it had guaranteed Japan's total defeat. The irony was bitter. The attack meant to destroy American naval power had instead awakened a sleeping giant, and once awakened, that giant had proven unstoppable. Sometimes the worst mistakes are the ones that look like brilliant successes. Sometimes the most dangerous victories are the ones that feel effortless. Japan learned this lesson the hardest way possible. August 6, 1942. The day the admirals knew the truth. The war was already over. Japan had just lost.